Hey everyone, I'm Brian Parks, and in this video I want to talk about the 5 obscure things in C#. This came out of a conversation I had with a colleague. He asked me what I thought the most obscure features I was aware of in C# were, and he shared some of the ones that he was aware of, and compiled both of our lists together, because there are some really good things. Not necessarily things you're going to use in your daily life, but certainly things that might be helpful if you run into a situation like the ones I'm about to describe. But there are also some gotchas associated with it. So I'm not going to get into things like garbage collection and that sort of thing, though garbage collection is an interesting topic. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and leave a like and a comment below, and I'll do a video in the future about garbage collection in C#. But in this video, I want to talk specifically about things you probably aren't aware of, things you probably wouldn't be aware of unless you went deep into advanced C#. So for the most part, I'm going to open up a Visual Studio project here, and I apologize, my cat is very insistent on joining me, scratching at my chair. So he always wants to learn more about C#, and I don't blame him. C# is a pretty cool thing. So unfortunately, the first thing isn't something that I can really demo because I need to build a large application, or more than I can do in this video. And it's getting the WSDL, the Web Service Description Language file for SOAP service. This was popular certainly in the early days of .NET. Is less popular now with REST and that sort of thing. But is definitely something that if you're using SOAP API, then you can get the WSDL, and it makes it really easy to build kind of a client, especially within .NET, to be able to talk to that web service. I believe the way to do that is just to go to the web service URL and then do $WSDL. My memory is a little bit fuzzy on that. It's been a while since I've done that, but I think that's how you do it. But that's the first obscure thing in C#, is that you can get that web service description language file from your API without doing a bunch of extra work. The second thing that I want to talk about is there's an option when you're doing regular expressions. So let's pull in our regular expression library here. Unfortunately, things work a little bit slower when I'm recording. So regex, what do we have here? Let's just do new regex. So one of the overloads takes a string and some options. So we're not actually going to run this code as is, so I'll leave an empty pattern. And then, what is it, regex options dot, and there's one compiled. Now, this option is actually very dangerous. In this scenario, it's actually okay. It's not great. It's not the worst it could possibly be. What this regex options not compiled actually does is, behind the scenes, C# will take your regular expression and turn it into the actual IL as if you'd compiled it into a DLL, and then load that into the app domain, the runtime. Basically, what that means is that every time that piece of code is hit, it does some compilation, load something into the app domain. That means if you hit that line of code multiple times, many times, you will continue to load this IL into the app domain, and once something's loaded into the app domain, it is never unloaded. The only way to unload something from an app domain is to actually kill the app domain completely. So if you have a static regular expression that only gets hit once and only gets compiled once at runtime, that's totally fine. You might get a performance improvement if you create it and compile it once and use it many, many, many times. Totally fine, not an issue. If you have a compiled regular expression as a member variable of a class, bad. Especially if you use that object or create new instances of that class over and over and over again. You're just going to increase the memory that's being used for the app domain, and eventually you'll run out. So that's a bad thing. You're going to have a bad day. That's a gotcha when it comes to this regex options.compiled. It's even dangerous enough that I know of some style guides that recommend against using the compiled option altogether. They just say, you know what, we've made a decision that we'll take the performance penalty for not using compiled regular expressions, just so that we don't end up hitting that memory ceiling there. Okay, so then the next one, which is kind of a good segue from this, is reflection.emit. Now, reflection.emit. So we actually have some really cool stuff in here that builds IL, right? So we can create a new, say, IL generator, and then there's actually a way to emit raw opcode. So you can actually build up IL programmatically. Now, the downside to this is the same gotcha as with the regex options.compiled option, is that if you're generating IL multiple times, you can eventually start to bloat the app domain and just load stuff into it that you can't access anymore. So the important part here is that once you've generated the IL, make sure that it's available to the rest of your application so that you generate it once and don't generate it again. Generating it once, totally fine. Generating it multiple times and then losing track of it, that's bad. That can get you into trouble. But this reflection.emit namespace is actually pretty cool. And definitely worth checking out if you have specific scenarios where you might want to, say, read in something that looks kind of like a program definition and then generate IL from it so that you're not interpreting it every single time you need it. But again, keep in mind that once you read it, once you generate that IL, it is in there for the duration of the app domain. That means once you if you restart the app domain, you have to regenerate it because it gets lost. And the second thing is that once you load it into the app domain, it is there until the app domain dies. So if you accidentally generate it multiple times, multiple copies are still there, and that can be bad. Okay, the next thing that is kind of cool but kind of obscure is that you can actually force the runtime to load DLLs from a different directory. And the way to do that is basically to add a handler to this assembly resolve event, but the exact details of that are a little bit tricky, and I'll actually do that in a separate video. I have that planned for another video where I want to go into detail about this. There are actually a couple different ways to achieve this. This is by far the easiest way to do it. But again, I'll do that in another video where I'll go deep into details on that. There's also, I think, a Stack flow post. If I can find that, I'll leave that linked in the description if you can't wait for the video. I think it'll be next week or the week after that I do that. Then the fifth and final option that is obscure in C# that I think is worth knowing is something that's I don't know how useful it is. I've used it a couple times. It's kind of useful when it comes to logging, but basically what this is a way to pull out the method that called a particular function. So we'll say log method name. And we'll actually write that function. Static void log name. And the way you do this is it's an attribute, and it's caller member name. And it populates a string. So all we'll do here is console.writeLine method name. Right? And I think this is in, yeah. Oh yes, and this does need to be an optional parameter, otherwise it won't compile. At runtime, this will be populated, but in order to get the compiler to be happy, you do need to provide a default value there since you're not providing it here. So let's go ahead and run that, and it should just print out main. Give it just a second. And here we go. Hello world and main. Perfect. Okay, before you go anywhere, I actually have a bonus one. And the reason this is a bonus one and not part of the actual list is because this is something that's new in C# 8. And it's called default interface implementation. So let's say I have an interface, my interface, and it has one method, it's a void method, do a thing. That's it. Perfectly valid interface, right? And if we want to create a class, implements interface, interface, right? Obviously, it's going to yell at us because we didn't implement do a thing. So what we need to do is public void do a thing. It doesn't care what we actually do inside that method. It just cares that we have it, right? So what happens if somewhere down the road you want to extend IMyInterface and you want to add a void do another thing? Well, any code that's dependent on IMyInterface that has already implemented IMyInterface now won't compile. That's not necessarily what you want, right? You might want to provide for backwards compatibility or forwards compatibility, whichever direction it is. So you can actually, in C# 8, you can provide a default implementation. So this is an interface, but for do another thing, I have an implementation. Obviously, in this case, it doesn't do anything, but that makes this part happy, this class implementation of the interface happy, because I don't have to provide an implementation for do another thing just to get things to compile again. Now, why is this important? I'll tell you why this is important. One of the very common C# interview questions, actually most object-oriented programming interview questions, is what is the difference between an abstract class and an interface? And prior to C# 8, the difference between an abstract class and an interface was that an abstract class could provide implementations for methods. That's the big difference. Neither of them can be instantiated on their own, and this doesn't change that. But the big difference was that abstract classes provided a default implementation, or if you don't use the virtual keyword, the implementation for a method. But in C# 8, that's not really the case anymore. So the last time I was asked that question, my response was actually, what version of C# are we talking about? And that was sufficient. That ended the line of discussion, because if you know that level of detail about C#, you know the difference between an interface and an abstract class. So if you're faced with that question in an interview, my recommendation is maybe ask about the version of C#. What version of C# are we talking about? Because obviously the functionality of interfaces has changed with C# 8. But in C# 8 and beyond, the difference is that in this case, in the interface, you are only providing a default implementation. So it's as if all of these methods have been declared virtual. So you can't provide like a final or a sealed implementation in an interface. It's just the default implementation. It's just the implementation that gets used if the method itself is not implemented inside the class that implements it. Prior to C# 8, the standard answer of an abstract class can have implementations and an interface can't is still valid. The new functionality in C# 8 doesn't change what came before. So with that, let me go back over here. So that's basically it for this video. I'm definitely curious what you think of these 6 obscure aspects of C#. If you have an aspect of C# that you think is obscure and potentially useful and helpful to point out, go ahead and leave a comment down below. If you like this video, click that thumbs up button, and be sure to subscribe, share it with your friends, share it with your colleagues, and maybe quiz each other and ask each other what's the most obscure thing in C# that you're aware of, and definitely comment below. I'd love to hear your ideas of what you think is obscure but potentially helpful, and if you agree with my list, or if you think my list is not the right list at all. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.